There we go.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. I'm sure that people will carry on dribbling in and all of that, but at 2 minutes past 10, I think it's time for us to get going. My name's Tristan Moreau. I'm an associate at Norton Rose Fulbright, as you can see on the slide. And today we're going to be chatting about artificial intelligence, some really cool technology, and looking at kind of how it works and why everyone should be thinking about it and using it in their workflows today. Before we get into that, though, just two things. I have the chat open, I have the Q&A open, so please do use them. I was saying kind of before everyone started joining, I really enjoy these iTOOsday sessions because there tends to be really good engagement from the participants, and it's lovely to see that already in the chat with all the good mornings. So keep them coming, keep the discussions going. Please keep your comments, your thoughts, and all of that in the chat window. If you have specific questions that you want me to address, I do ask that you kind of just put that then into the Q&A, just because it's easier then to specifically respond to that. However, I am keeping an eye on chat as well, just to kind of comment on the discussions and that going on in chat as well. So please do use them. It's great for engagement, and this presentation is actually kind of centered around having engagement. You'll see there's a couple interactive parts as we'll get going. So by all means, carry on that going, and we're going to chat today about artificial intelligence, how it works, why you should be thinking about it. And in fact, the title screen that you see in front of you has a bit of a surprise. I'm not going to give it away yet, but it's relevant to the discussion we're going to be having. So by all means, have a look at that for a second. Try and see if you can figure out what it is. If you think you figured it out, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll chat about that a little bit later. So first things first, Yolandi, if you can throw up that poll. We're going to have a poll. I'm kind of curious to understand from all of you how familiar you are with artificial intelligence. And kind of one of the things we were chatting about just now is, what is kind of the scale, especially at the top end. So obviously not familiar at all. I think that one's slightly obvious. I would say extremely familiar. I would put this, if you already know what GPT-3 is, if you know what Stable Diffusion is, if you know what DALL-E is, if you know how to interact with those artificial intelligences, then number 5 is for you. I think that's kind of the scale. I can see the responses coming in. Okay. This is interesting. We won't put up, I don't think the results are available for you yet. I'm going to carry on letting you guys vote for a second. They're about what I expected.
About 64% voted. I think we should give it another few seconds, maybe another 30 seconds, and then I'll share results with you. Good.
Yeah, happy with that. Thank you, Lundy. Also, by the way, everyone, I introduced her a little bit earlier before people had joined on, but as you just heard, that's Yolandi Vippenaar. She's one of our members from our learning and development. She helped put this presentation together. If you think this presentation looks absolutely awesome, 100% of the credit goes to her. She made this thing look incredible. I'm really excited to share it and discuss it with you. And it's really great.
Thanks, Tristan.
All right, about 70% of participants. Let's share the results there, Yolandi. Kind of what I expected. 26% with you not familiar at all. That's great. I hope we can at least push you up to a slightly familiar, if not a moderately familiar. But the majority of you sitting kind of slightly familiar, and then either not at all familiar or moderately familiar. A few very familiars. Only one person said extremely familiar. I'm not going to ask you to say who you are. I'm very curious as to what you are. I suspect we might have some really interesting discussions. Feel free to reach out to me and we can have those discussions later. But interesting to see where everyone is. Hopefully we can move some of you guys up in your knowledge level today. So what is artificial intelligence? From a very high level overview, artificial intelligence is the ability of a computer program or machine to think and to learn. However, I'm a little cautious using phrases like that because, as you'll see through the discussion today, one of the important things to do when discussing artificial intelligences and thinking about artificial intelligences is to be careful not to personify them. They are not human. They're not even close to human in their abilities yet, at the very least. And so, at a very high level, when we say they think, what we actually mean is that they're able to process information in a more general or abstract manner, similar to how when we think, we don't necessarily think in structured procedural arguments. And that's kind of what programming has been up until today, very structured, very procedural. And so computers don't think, they respond, whereas artificial intelligences are able to interpret and provide responses it thinks is most likely to the data that you give, not necessarily to the specific procedural way that a program would normally respond. It is a field of computer science as well, and it deals with the creation of intelligent agents, which are systems that can reason, learn, and act autonomously. Again here, intelligent agents meaning greater than what our normal kind of algorithmic or programmatic understanding is, but not to the level quite yet of humans. But that is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal of artificial intelligences is to create machines that can think and act like a human being. For those of you who are aware of the Turing tests, Alan Turing is kind of one of the founders of computing, with the incredible work they did at Bletchley Park in the United Kingdom to crack the Enigma code during World War II. But he also afterwards kind of did a lot of thinking about computer science, and he had what was called the Turing test. The Turing test is if you put if you manage to have a human interact with a computer in a way that the human is not able to distinguish whether it's interacting with a computer or a human, that is then that passes the Turing test. We've already got artificial intelligences that can pass the Turing test. In fact, we're going to play around with one a little bit later, but that doesn't quite get us yet to the level of thinking and acting like a human being. It's still able to kind of produce a couple results which are a little bit weird and that show that it's not a human. And also when we understand how it operates, we can see that actually it's not even close to thinking or acting like a human yet. But we'll get a bit more into that later. And kind of the reason that we want AIs around and kind of the high level, what the benefits are, is that, by providing humans with a lot of data, by providing computers with a lot of data and these artificial intelligences to then analyze the data, it allows us as humans to kind of stand back a bit from that incredibly resource and time-intensive data analytics part, and rather use the analysis that we get from artificial intelligences to streamline our workflows, to streamline what it is that we do, and to save us time and effort, and also avoid us making mistakes, or at least help us in avoiding those mistakes. But overall, artificial intelligence already can be extremely beneficial to humans. It can help us make better decisions. It can automate tasks and even improve our own cognitive abilities. And we're going to show a few examples of how that can happen today. So that's high level what artificial intelligences are. But I guess the main part is perhaps understanding a bit more how artificial intelligences work. So I think if we can understand how artificial intelligences work, then it's a lot easier to understand what it is that they are and what their capabilities are. So how do artificial intelligences work? Well, to be quite honest, I was a little unsure of how to answer this question myself. And so instead, what I decided to do is to reach out to a couple friends of mine that are in the industry developing and working with artificial intelligences and ask them how they would answer this question. So how it is that they would describe what an artificial intelligences are. You may know some of these people, you may not know some of these people, but they're really great people doing some really good things, and they were kind enough to answer my questions for me. So the first guy I reached out to is a guy you might have heard of. His name's Elon Musk. He's a South African-born guy, and he runs a company called SpaceX, another one called Tesla, and recently bought a website you might have heard of called Twitter. And so I asked him how artificial intelligences work, and his response was that artificial intelligence is the process of programming a computer to make decisions for itself. This can be done through a number of methods, including but not limited to rule-based systems, decision trees, genetic algorithms, artificial neural networks, and fuzzy logic systems. He's an engineer, guys. I know this is a very engineering answer, but it is correct in a sense. It's how do we make computers make decisions? And there's a bunch of different ways. I'm not really going to explain all of them. The rule-based systems was algorithmic, so where you just say, if this is asked, then respond with this. That's kind of the most traditional. Those aren't really classified as artificial intelligences anymore. The artificial intelligences that we'll interact with are kind of a combination of the latter two, which is neural networks and fuzzy logic systems. Neural networks, as the name implies, is when we code an AI to mimic having a set of neurons like we do in our brain. The exact details, so I used to have a version of this presentation where I used to explain exactly and in detail how neural networks work with the different layers and all of that. I realize now we don't need to do that anymore. It's not necessary to interact with artificial intelligences and understand their capabilities to necessarily have a very detailed understanding of how they work. And I'll show you why that is in a second. But that was Elon's response. I then reached out to another friend of mine, a guy by the name of Mark Zuckerberg. You might have heard of his company. It was called Facebook. It's actually rebranded recently to Meta. I asked him the same question to kind of see what he answered. Less of an engineering guy, so I was kind of hoping maybe the answer would be a bit easier to understand. He said there is no one answer to this question, as artificial intelligence is a vast and complex field. 100% true. However, some basics of artificial intelligence, including understanding and replicating human cognitive abilities like learning and problem solving, as well as creating machines that autonomously carry out tasks. That middle part, I think, is perhaps the most important thing to understand, the difference between an artificial intelligence and a normal program that you might interact with, is that ability to understand and replicate human cognitive abilities like learning and problem solving. When we use artificial intelligences now, we don't necessarily have to have the full understanding of what the question is that we need to ask. We can give it a bunch of the data and it will give us what it suspects the answers are that we need. The same way as a human, we don't necessarily need to be asked a specific question to understand kind of the point that the person is trying to understand or get to. And that's one of the really cool things about using artificial intelligences, which we'll show. But that was Mark's answer, a little bit less of an engineering answer, which I appreciated. But I kind of realized after speaking to both of them that perhaps they're a little too high level in their operations with artificial intelligences. And I actually needed someone who is a lot closer to the ground and using these artificial intelligences and getting asked these kind of questions on a daily basis to perhaps have the best answer. And so I reached out to another friend of mine called Demis Hassabis. He's the CEO of a company called Norton Technologies, which is a division of Alphabet. Alphabet, for those of you who aren't aware, is Google's holding company. And DeepMind Technologies is doing some really cool artificial intelligence development work for Google. So if you see a lot of Google's artificial intelligence work, most, not all, but most of that is coming from DeepMind. And his response was a really cool one. He said there are three main components to artificial intelligence: learning, reasoning, and self-correction. Learning is the ability to take in new information and incorporate into your understanding of the world. Reasoning is the ability to draw logical conclusions from that information. And self-correction is the ability to identify and correct errors in your understanding. That fundamentally is what artificial intelligences do, right? They learn from the data we give them. They're able to reason from that data or from further data that we then give it, and they're able to self-correct. They're able to improve their own abilities as they go. And the way they do that is by mimicking human intelligence. Now, as most of you are probably wondering, I don't actually have access to Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Demis. That was mostly a lie. And for those of you who know what the reference is on the screen, I'm not going to explain it, but welcome. The cake is a lie. I don't have access to those people. I really wish I did. I have a number of questions for Elon at the moment specifically, not all of which are related to AI. But what that actually was, is that was me. So I used an AI that was specifically tasked with replicating answers that those people would give. And in fact, that's not the only place thus far that you've seen AI. A lot of this presentation today is AI generated. In fact, that very first title slide that I pointed you to, that entire title slide was created by an artificial intelligence. I said to the artificial intelligence, give me an image of a futuristic cityscape in which artificial intelligence has helped design the city. And that's the response it gave to me. A lot of the content that you're going to see today or hear today was generated with the assistance of an AI, of me saying to the AI, how do I explain this concept, and it giving me a response, and that was incorporated into the speaker notes. All those responses that you saw, those were AI generated, where I said to the AI, how does an artificial intelligence work? Explain it to me as if you were Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Demis Habbis. And what it's doing is it's then using all the data it has. So the one I was specifically using is one called GPT-3, which is an AI developed by a company called OpenAI. They're definitely one of the leaders in AI research. In fact, we're going to play around with GPT-3 in a moment. And it used all the data it has, which is, when I last looked, it was about 100 billion data points that they had given it to it, most of which is kind of scrawled from the general internet. So, the available English internet as well, although it does actually have multiple language support. And so it's going through and it's saying, right, how does Elon Musk generally speak? How does he generally respond to questions? And then how would he respond to this kind of question? Putting that all together and giving me the response in less than a second. Really powerful, really cool. And that's kind of what I want to get across to you guys today. These AI tools are incredibly powerful already. They're not perfect. They have a long way to go, but they're incredibly powerful today. And there's some incredibly cool things that you can do today with those artificial intelligences. So let's explain a bit more about how AIs work so that you can understand it. As I've already said, it mimics the way humans reason. So as humans, part of the way we reason is we have our memories, we have our experiences, and we infer from those memories and experiences the responses to the present, right? AIs do a similar thing. What we do is we give AIs training data, or data in which we've gone through and say, this information means this, to initially start it off with, and then we'll actually just start giving it more general data for it to interpret and understand. And it uses that data to build what I think is most easily understood as a probability matrix. So, for example, GPT-3 is what's called a large language model. And so what we do with that is we give it a whole bunch of text information. Initially, we'll say what that text information is, and then as it starts to develop an understanding, we can just give it more and more data for it to analyze itself. And what it does is it doesn't necessarily actually interpret that data. What it does is it says, well, these words tend to be near these words. And so the probability when I'm given this first set of words that the next set of words appears is higher than some other random words. And the more and more data you feed it, the better and better this probability matrix becomes. And so ultimately with large language models, all it's actually doing is understanding at an extremely complex level that even as humans, we don't necessarily understand what the relationships are between words in our language, and between sentiments in our language, and between phrases in our language, and between characters in our language, and using all of this to kind of develop a probability of what's going to come next after a certain amount of input that you give to it. And that very high level is how AI works. They probabilistically determine responses to new data, right? And that's great for where we are currently, and that can do some incredibly powerful things, as you've already seen, as you'll continue to see through this presentation. But it's not perfect. In fact, one of the really easy ways to see that it's not perfect is for those of you who have kind of Google Assistant or Siri on your phone, you'll notice that it doesn't seem to do a very basic thing, which is to check the response it probabilistically determines against a smaller kind of data set. So for example, going back to your phone, if I say to my phone, call Jake TV, it will often say, sorry, there is no Jake TV in your phone book or in your contact list. Instead of just looking and going, okay, well, TV seems quite close to TV, perhaps that's the correct response. So there isn't a secondary check. And that's kind of the next step, we suspect, in artificial intelligence development, is using the probabilistic determination to cross-check against kind of a specific database that we say this is where your response is going to come from. As I say, AIs are incredibly powerful. In fact, you've probably already interacted with a number of AIs today, if not in the past week. For those of you who use Adobe Acrobat, specifically its OCR, or optical character recognition function, it's a really cool function if you haven't. What it does is if you have a PDF where you can't highlight the text, you can click optimize, I think it is, in Adobe Acrobat, but different programs have different wordings for it. All of it is what's called an optical character recognition software. And what that's doing is it's using an AI to look at the characters, so literally an image of the characters, and say that image is most likely going to be a letter A or a letter C or a letter F. And that sounds simple. But if we think about what it's actually doing, the problem is it can do that across a whole variety of fonts, a whole variety of scan qualities, a whole variety of font sizing. And so what we're actually doing, instead of trying to give it an image repository for every single potential character, we're just using an artificial intelligence to analyze those images off its probability matrix. So it's, when we've given it a whole bunch of data of what characters tend to look like, to then say, well, this is probably an A. And that's why you'll see it's not always perfect. In fact, I've noticed, number one, that it's got better, but number two, that it has a problem with J and I, specifically because of how similar they can sometimes look across fonts, and it will sometimes put a J where an I is. Although what I've seen they also do now is they actually do word checks. So instead of just what characters is likely to be, it will say, well, does that make sense in terms of the characters next to it for a word that I might recognize? Really cool AI that you probably already interacted with. Another one which can be really cool but isn't great yet is customer service chatbots. So you've probably seen this on websites. Maybe you've had to interact with one on the phone. Those ones are the ones that tend to have more problems. But customer service chatbots, where it will say, what questions do you have? Is there something I can help you with? Those are often not a person sitting behind it. They're actually just an artificial intelligence looking at the question that you give it and responding. And on that customer service chatbots, we're going to be playing with one in a moment. And so what I would really like, especially to the brokers, I want you guys to put in chat. It doesn't have to be in the Q&A. You can just put it in the chat. Some questions that you get asked quite regularly in your job. Try not go really hardcore, like you need to refer that to a senior broker to answer. Just kind of more your general questions that you guys get answered, that you guys get asked, and that you really wish something could answer instead of you, like a chatbot. We're going to play around with one. We can see if it can answer the questions for you. But before that, these are kind of some of the low-level AIs that we already see. How long will it take my claim to be paid out? In fairness, I am sure that is a question that gets asked to brokers all the time. I don't think that's one the AI is going to be able to answer, though. But yeah, these are kind of the low levels. Where are we going? What is the future of AI integration in the next 2 years or so? Yeah, that shorter time frame. And I think it's quite interesting to look at this kind of across 3 different segments: your doctors, your lawyers, how I'm going to be replaced, and your teachers, and how AIs can facilitate those roles going forward. Because that's the important thing to understand with artificial intelligence, is they're not likely to actually replace people's abilities yet, but they are going to more increasingly become an augmentation to your workflow. You are likely in the next couple of years to work with almost what will be like a team of artificial intelligences in doing your job. And so what does that look like for some of the specific professions? Well, if you're a doctor, you're probably going to have an AI that assists you with making diagnoses. In fact, this is something that's already starting to rear. We already have artificial intelligences which can kind of look at X-ray scans or at MRI scans and say, oh, well, this kind of looks like it might be a tumor, or this looks like it might be this kind of lung disease, or something like that. We're already starting to see it, and that's definitely going to accelerate in the next couple of years. For us lawyers, AI assistants are really likely to probably help us in our research space. There's a lot of time that we spend going and researching the law in certain aspects to be able to properly advise our clients. What does the legislation say on X, Y, Z point? What does the case law say on that point? And it's likely that going forward, we're going to have AIs which we can just simply ask that question to, and it will then help us with our research and start giving us answers, which we can then go and more specifically research on those answers, because you're going to have to cross-check. I'll come back to that in a second. Also, loving the questions. Some of them are really funny. And some of them, I think, we're definitely going to be able to play around with, and it's going to be cool to see. So keep them coming. We're not going to get through all of them, but we'll definitely go through some of them. And then I think one of perhaps the more interesting spaces are kind of in teaching and learning, because I think there's a lot we can do to modernize the way we teach, we learn, and I think there's a lot that AIs can do to help there. So if you're a teacher, it's likely in the next couple of years that you're going to have an AI assistant which helps you create lesson plans and grade papers. In fact, that first part is something, I almost did with this presentation. I used an AI to help develop the script and the flow of this presentation. And that's not too dissimilar to creating a lesson plan and helping to grade papers. Very easy on mathematics. In fact, we already have things for mathematics and for science, but very difficult for English, for literature, for poetry, for history, where you've got those discursive essays. But we're definitely starting to see kind of sentiment analysis becoming a thing in artificial intelligences, where you can give it a bunch of text and it can summarize it. It can give you the sentiment of what it was. It can also tell you how grammatically correct it is, or how it could be improved in terms of its writing. If any of you have heard have heard of a program called Grammarly, that started out as a algorithmic programming, similar to kind of Word spell check, but now it uses artificial intelligences to suggest ways to reword things, to suggest ways to more concisely get across the information, and all of that is AI driven. Word's also actually starting to integrate that. And so I think it's going to be really cool. What about our specific industry? And what do we already see? There are already some really cool startups that are developing AI tools, both in our industry and in others. And I thought I would flag kind of a couple of them. So the first one is a Chinese startup based out of Beijing called Yandudu Technologies. And it provides a platform solution for fraud detection in auto insurance claims. For any of you who know about the Chinese insurance market, fraud is something that, specifically in their motor section, China, Russia, increasingly here, you have massive issues with fraud. And so this startup uses AI algorithms to continuously screen suspicious cases and detect false claims due to drunk driving, false reports, intentional accidents, and others. So what it does is it takes the kind of all the data that it gets is what we call big data. So big data is where you're collecting generally terabytes and terabytes of data. That's, if you hear about Google tracking you, that's part of their big data collection. What they're actually doing is that they don't really care what you specifically are doing. They're feeding that into general trends analysis and seeing what people are doing as general. So that's big data. But this startup uses big data with some other kind of tech buzzwords, cloud computing and blockchain. which I'm not necessarily going to get into too much here. But it takes that, and then it takes the specific claims information that you give it, and it goes and it says, something seems a little bit off here. They say that they were stuck in a traffic jam, but from the data we have, there was no traffic in that area at the time. Or they say that they were on a free-flowing road, but actually they should have been stuck in gridlock. And it uses that to kind of start flagging what might be suspicious or fraud. That's very simplified. It does some really cool things. But yeah, the platform is designed to help protect auto insurance providers by predicting which claims are likely to be fraudulent or not, to help streamline their fraud checking process. Because obviously, if you're getting in numerous claims every day, like these large insurers would be. I mean, China is a 1 billion person market, and their car saturation is also quite high. So you're talking about, tens, if not hundreds of claims a day. It's a lot better to have a fraud team which can then just specifically look at one or two claims that are flagged, as opposed to having to check every single one. Another one is called SynchroSure. SynchroSure is a US-based startup that provides digital underwriting services for small business and nascent industries. This area of artificial intelligence underwriting, is where I think we're definitely going to see growth in this industry. So it's an AI-powered platform that provides underwriting services within minutes, requires no carrier appointments, and administers policies for the producers. Again, remember I said AIs use probability matrices. Well, these are not too dissimilar to the risk matrices that we already use in underwriting. And so AIs are really good at kind of taking your underwriting information and flagging whether there are potential underwriting issues or not, if you should deep dive further into things, or if actually this seems like a rather decent risk. And that's what SynchroSure is trying to develop. The platform empowers producers by providing curated lists of leads to grow their portfolio and commissions earnings as well. As brokers, I'm sure that sounds incredible for you guys, just having an AI saying, hey, considering this kind of product is designed like this, these are probably the type of people you should be reaching out to. And that's one of the things SynchroSure is trying to develop. And yeah, it partners with insurance producers in the US market so that it can understand different kind of insurance products and advise accordingly. It's not the only area. We're seeing AI also a lot. Obviously, I'm in the legal space, and we're seeing it come up a lot in the legal space as well. In fact, I was having a chat with this startup. I thought it was a UK-based startup when I actually started this presentation. And it just so happened while doing this presentation at one of our industry events, I actually ran into the South African reps of Luminance because they're coming into the South African market as well. And so Luminance uses artificial intelligence to read and understand complex, detailed documents, enabling users to carry out necessary due diligences more efficiently. One of the really cool ones that we're actually looking at is that it also has an AI which attaches as an extension to Microsoft Word, and it analyzes contracts against kind of your precedent bank, and then it flags clauses that are different to how you would normally structure it, so that when we get these, sometimes 150 to 200 page agreements, instead of having to manually check every single clause to see that it's in line with how we would normally draft or want that clause drafted, the AI can scan everything and just highlight and be like, green, 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 you don't need to worry about those. Orange, this one's not too dissimilar, but maybe just check. Red, there's nothing like this in your precedent bank. This is not a clause that you would normally include. Really have a look at that clause. So really designed at optimizing our workflow around there. Genie AI is another one. It's also a UK-based startup which develops artificial intelligence platform called SuperDrafter that empowers lawyers to draft contracts using the entire knowledge of the firm, very similar to kind of that Illuminance tool that I just spoke about. By recommending anonymized clauses from relevant contracts in the market as well. Not too dissimilar to how how the insurance industry works with standardized wordings. We do as well. And then perhaps one of the really cool ones is something called Ross Intelligence, which is a US-based startup aiming to create an AI legal research tool. So I spoke about this a little bit earlier in terms of how we are likely to see AIs in the legal industry. Ross is one of those first players in the US market specifically. You can ask it questions and it will respond to you with what the different answers would be in the different jurisdictions in the United States. Really cool. Medical's one I've also already flagged about. There's some really cool startups already doing work in this space, as I said. PMX is a South Korean startup, and they do that multimodal imaging diagnosis solutions that I spoke about already, where you can feed in its MRIs, feed in X-rays, feed in kind of your doctor's notes, and it will start saying, okay, maybe double check for this kind of, you know, looking at the scans and that, it might be this kind of disease and that. And what's really cool about those AIs is, you know, as much as it's already been proven, they're not yet better than doctors. Doctors are better at doing the diagnoses. Last I looked, the AIs are getting to about 70% as good as the doctors. But what they're better at doctors than doing is flagging rare diseases. Obviously, as a doctor, if you're seeing kind of the same things regularly often, those are quick to pick up. But if it's something that, you know, is only 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million cases, you might have only ever seen that in medical school. And so the AIs are really good at flagging for those kind of diseases and saying, hey, this kind of looks like it might be this. Run your test, double check for this rare disease. So PMX is one of the South Korean ones there. There's another one called Neural which is a Brazilian startup, and that uses AIs for real-time medical text analysis, which is something I really wish on the MedMal side of things. So we also have a MedMal team here, and interpreting hospital records are atrocious and really difficult. I mean, the jokes about doctors' handwritings, not really a joke. And Neural is designed to try and help with that. So really cool. But let's try and play around with that AI I said we're going to play around with. I think we've got some really cool questions. Yeah, better than Dr. Google, I hope. Yeah. So that's the thing. Google is not, it is AI powered, but it's not specifically designed for the process. And that's kind of the thing to remember with AI. So AGI, artificial general intelligence, we don't really have yet. And so your AIs, which are specifically designed for a process, can be really good at doing what they do. That's one of the things. But as I said, let's play around with one that I threw together really quickly. As I said, so this is what you're going to see now. This is what's called GPT-3. One second. So this is GPT-3. That should come up. And so GPT-3 is OpenAI's large language model. And so it's really good at taking textual analysis and providing you responses. And so, for example, what you can build on top of GPT-3 is a really good chatbot. And so what I've set up here, I've left the prompt so that you can see it. So what a prompt is what you feed into the artificial intelligence. So you say, you know, here's the text, the prompt, give me a response to that prompt. And so here I've said, you know, the following conversation is with an AI assistant which specializes in insurance. The assistant is helpful, creative, clever, and funny. And then I've also just started the chat already. That tends to help it give better responses. So let's have a look at some of these questions, and we're going to feed it in and see what the AI responds. This is completely live, so there might be some really weird responses. I do have safety filters turned on, so you shouldn't see anything horrendous, which we'll chat about in a second. But let's see how it responds. So this is one I deal with quite a lot, so I'm going to use it. So this comes from Saskia. It says, what is average and how does it apply to my insurance policy? I'm going to just copy and paste that. It might throw it out with my insurance policy, because it doesn't obviously know what your insurance policy is. But let's have a look at how it responds. It helps if I didn't have windows in the way. There we go. So that, as you saw, is a completely live response. It says, so average is a term used to describe the amounts that an insurance company will pay out in the event of a claim. The average is calculated by taking the total amount of money paid out by the insurer over a period of time. Okay, so it gave a completely wrong answer, which is interesting, but watch, I suspect I know why. And that's the thing with where AI is today. You need to understand its work to be able to, how it works to be able to properly use them. So what if we say, what is average? Average is a mean set of, you're already told. You know, the funny thing is I was using this just now and it gave so much better responses. I was going to use this to show you how great it is. I know. How does average apply to insurance contracts? Average applies to the expected value of the contract, which is determined by the insurer. That's about the closest we're going to get, but a good response to see how it's not perfect. You brokers will still have a job, but let's try and see if we can get some responses to show you where it's going. So this one comes from Dulce. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sorry if I'm not. Why do I need professional indemnity insurance? This is one I tried, so I'm really hoping it will give the appropriate response. There are many reasons why you might need professional indemnity insurance. For example, if you give professional advice or provide professional services, you can be held liable if your advice or service causes financial loss to a client. Professional indemnity insurance can protect you from those types of claims. Okay, it's a better answer, but what's really cool about these type of AIs is you can carry on the conversation, and that's one of the new developments that we have. Whereas previously you could only kind of question and response. Now you can have a conversation. So I can say, what kind of financial losses would be covered? I suspect it's going to say it depends on your insurance policy. We'll see. Cost of defending you in court. All right. So that one's a little bit better. We can see where it's going. Let's have a look at what other questions we might have. So I am filtering out questions where I know that it's just not going to have enough data to respond. And that's kind of the point. And that's why I say it's definitely going to be an augmentation process and not a replacement process. Because the AI, you know, when you say, for example, what is the excess, it doesn't know to cross-reference that to a policy. But what you can do is you can take this kind of AI, build it on top of your policy database, and then when you have the client log in, it can cross-reference your client to your policy, and then when you say what is the excess, it knows to go and look at your policy, pull the excess, and give that as a response. This is a very basic AI. It's not going to be able to do that because obviously it doesn't have access to your guys' databases. But here's another one. I'm curious to see what its response will be. Hopefully it works better than the last one where I was just curious. Coming from Marvin, it says, why do I have to pay an excess? The excess is the amount you pay towards a claim. It is designed to discourage people from making small claims, as you can end up costing the insurer more in administrative costs than you can with work. There we go. It was a nice, decent response. I see we're getting more. Okay, so Tina's reworded the average one, which I think might give us a decent response. So I'm going to put that in. Let's see if that works. The average condition insurance policy is the amount the insurer will pay for a covered loss. Nah. So what I suspect the actual problem here is that GPT-3 is a internationally built AI. So it's not specific. In fact, we can try and make it specific. Let's see if it helps. But I suspect the issue is that average in that terminology isn't consistent across international markets. And I suspect that's what it's having an issue with. But if we say here, South African insurance, it might help. Let's have a look. No. All right. Let's do one more question. So I'm going to sorry, I'm just scanning the questions. All right. So I'm going to try one here from Belinda van Wyk. It says, what will my public liability cover? I'm going to amend it slightly. What will my public liability insurance cover? Your public liability insurance cover will cover you against legal liability arising from personal injury or property damage that you can cause to another person while carrying out your business activities. That's pretty cool. What I also know it's actually surprisingly good at, because I was playing around with this, is you don't even have to necessarily spell it out. So, for example, why should I get D&O cover? There are many reasons why you should consider getting D&O cover, including the fact that it can help protect you from personal financial loss in events that you're sued for wrongful decisions or actions while in your role as a director or officer. So as you can see, it is far from perfect. I should also caveat, as I said, this is not an AI specifically designed for the process. It's not really what you would use, but that was just kind of to show you where the general capabilities already are. And how that can already start augmenting our workflow process. But as I said earlier, couple people say I should have tried underinsurance. That's a good point. I should have tried that terminology. Using artificial intelligences, you need to be cognizant of a number of things. You need to be cognizant of the limits of the technology, but you also need to be cognizant of the fact that artificial intelligences are incredibly powerful tools. And so we need to be careful about how we use that, the power that it gives us. And that's where we have this development of what's called AI ethics and responsible AI, which simply asks the question, how do we design an AI? So this ethical AI. So how do we design an AI which acts as intended? So it sticks to its intended purpose. That artificial intelligence I was just showing around, there's nothing to stop you asking it other random questions and it will provide you responses. So that's not great to actually have as client facing, because they can start messing around with your AI if they wanted. So how do we make sure it stays to its intended purpose? How do we ensure that it fosters the moral values that we want as society to foster? And finally, how do we ensure that the AIs remain accountable and understandable to humans? The accountability here is not talking about kind of like a HAL 9000, let's take over the world and kill everyone. It means accountable in the sense of the human can understand how or why it's getting to those responses. And so I'm going to give you two examples of where we've got this wrong to show why we need to be considering this. So the first one is the story of Microsoft's Tay chatbot. So we've just played with a chatbot. Microsoft created one, and it went horribly wrong. And so I prefer to call the story how Twitter turned an AI from human-loving to a Nazi in less than 24 hours. So Microsoft's Tay chatbot was launched on the 23rd of March, 2016. And it was an experiment in conversational understanding from the Microsoft website. They stated that when launched, the more you chat with Tay, the smarter it gets, learning and engaging with people through casual and playful conversation. And then they made what I think was one of the greatest mistakes. They launched Tay onto Twitter. So you could tweet at Tay and it would respond. And it started off pretty good. So one of the first tweets, can I just say, super stoked to meet you. Humans are super cool. We're on to a good start. It doesn't want to kill us yet. So this was after a couple interactions, a couple hours, and you can already start to see the weirdness coming through. And it devolved and got worse from there, until eventually it got a bit Nazi on all of us. And in fact, Microsoft ended up pulling Tay from Twitter in less than 24 hours. And this is what I say about sticking to the intended purpose and fostering moral values. We've learned from experiences like Tay. So that chatbot that we're playing with now, it has a safety check to make sure that the responses it's giving is not necessarily contradictory to the values that we want to foster, that it's not giving out hateful comments or comments that incite violence, or some other things. So you need to be cognizant of that. But it's not just the way the AI works. We also need to be cognizant of it in the sense of how we design the AI, and also the kind of data and biases that we as humans have when we're trying to design that AI. And this really came to the fore in the United States when we started having AIs which were used in processing home loan applications. So a number of the US banks are starting to use AIs to process home loan applications. It's a kind of perfect use case for AI. You have this really large set of data which is somewhat structured but not perfectly structured, and you have this really large precedent bank of prior home loans that you've gone and you've approved, and how those have turned out, and you use that to kind of develop an AI which can then look at the new home loans and say to you, well, there's a high likelihood of default on this application, or there's a low likelihood. You tie that in with kind of the consumer's credit history, and you start getting some really good augmentation to your home loan team, very similar to what we do with AI assisted underwriting in insurance. But there's a big problem. And for those of you who know what the map on screen means, you probably already kind of jumped ahead to the conclusion here. So this map on screen is from Brooklyn in the United States, and it shows what's called redlining. So the Federal Housing Administration in the United States was one of the organizations that came out of the New Deal. And it was government guarantees that were given to home loan owners. But this was done before the abolishment of Jim Crow. So we're looking at, the late 40s, early 50s is when it started. It continued all the way through. And so what they also did is they did what was called redlining. And so they went through and they had a look at districts which were mostly African-American. And they said, well, we're not going to give home loans to people in these areas. In fact, it then went a step further and it looked at the districts which were next to those districts and said, well, you're at risk of encroachment by African Americans, and so we're not going to give you home loans, or we're going to make the requirements a lot more stringent. What this meant is that people of color in America had no access or limited access to home loans. When they did, they were at high interest rates, and that meant a historically higher default rate and historically low generational wealth buildup. Which doesn't sound like a problem today because we don't have those laws. We've got rid of them, and so how does that tie through to the AI? Well, the problem is that the historical data that you use to train it has this in it. It has the fact that people of color didn't have access and thus had these higher default rates, but it didn't know that that's the reason why. And so it started making the correlation of going, well, people of color tend to default on their home loans more often, and so we need to increase the interest rate on those home loans to offset the defaults, which is a discriminatory practice today. But the AI doesn't understand that. And so that's why you need to be cognizant of how you design these AIs and the kind of data that you give it to try and weed out, because it will amplify human biases. AIs are very good at amplifying trends and patterns and data. And if those trends and patterns come from biases that humans have, then it will just amplify those trends and data. So as I said, it looks at the history, it amplifies biases, especially with algorithmic assessments. The UK regulators actually stepped in with these kind of things, and if you now have to prove that an algorithm before you use it in the UK space will work to reduce discrimination and not increase it. And we suspect that kind of regulation will roll out. I'm running a bit behind time, so I'm going to speed up. And so, yeah, when you design the AI itself, you need to start thinking about the values and the principles that you build into these AI systems. How much control users should have over the decisions made by the AI. That can be a bit difficult, but you do need to think about that when you're designing the systems. And also, who should be held responsible for the AI system's actions? We can't sue an AI, but we need to have an accountability structure to make sure that those AIs don't just run rampant. And so you need to think about that. And that's kind of where we as Norton Rose can come in to try and help you. Yes, there was going to be a hook at the end of this. You knew it was coming. And so our head of innovation and technology, Narishka Bowen, she actually presented to you guys a couple of weeks ago on cyber risk management. But she has this great point where she says, involve us at the start so that we can stop problems from happening instead of involving us when the problems have happened to try and solve them. And I think that's the kind of key point if you're looking at using artificial intelligences here, because we can start helping you understand the requirements around responsible and ethical AI. Are you asking yourselves these questions to make sure that the AI you're developing operates as intended? Have you considered your data collection? You need data to feed into an AI for it to operate properly. But in collecting data, you need to be cognizant of what the regulations say you can or can't do. You need to consider POPI, you need to consider GDPR and how those things affect it, and we can help you there. There's also definitely legal risks associated with developing and using AIs. As I said, whom do we hold accountable for the artificial intelligences that we develop? Those are things that you need to consider. And then finally, although not quite yet in South Africa, definitely internationally and definitely developing in South Africa, is this regulatory landscape around using artificial intelligences and how it is that those can work. So that does kind of bring me to the end. I see there are some questions, and so I'm really looking forward to having these discussions on those questions. Before I get into that, though, if you did enjoy this conversation, by all means, please feel free to reach out. My email's there. Also, if you want to see kind of more discussions on this, I post on these kind of topics quite regularly on LinkedIn. You're welcome to follow me there. And let's have a look at some of the questions. So the first one I see is from Renee. And it says, so if AIs mimic human reason, how would one prevent some of humans' greatest abilities like confirmation bias in AI? This question, and once quantum computers become mainstream, how do we keep control of AI? Really interesting questions, really difficult questions to answer as well. There are entire AI researchers kind of looking into this. So as I said, you need to be careful when you're designing these AIs. You need to think about and be purposeful with how the AI is designed to try and prevent these biases and these from cropping up. At the moment, that's kind of almost the best we can do, is be intentional and then also build in safety mechanisms to look at all of that. In terms of quantum computing and AI, so this is, so I didn't get into it because it's a rabbit hole, but it's what's called the singularity effect. So once we get an AI which is intelligent, which surpasses human intelligence, and then is able to make itself more and more intelligent, which is what we think. So quantum computing is just a type of computing, and it will make things a lot more powerful in the way that we compute. If we tie that into artificial intelligences, well, then that says we could potentially end up with really incredibly intelligent AIs and approaching artificial general intelligences. We don't know yet. There's some really interesting discussions I encourage you to look at online about the singularity effect and how we get around that, because you also can't like. So there's another thing called the red button problem, which is, well, why don't we just program into the AI the ability to switch it off? Well, if the AI is smarter than you, it's going to understand that there is that off button, and that off button is a risk to its existence. And the same way we as humans try to minimize risks to our existence, there's nothing to say the AI won't do the same. Really interesting question. I'm sorry I can't give you the answer, but the reality is there isn't necessarily an answer there. Guys, we are at 11. If you need to jump off, 100% understand. Thank you very much for joining. I'm going to carry on for a little bit answering the questions for those of you who are still sticking around. But yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate the comments streaming past in chat. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation and found it interesting. Okay, so the next two I think are questions for the AI. So I'm not necessarily going to answer that here. But Sharon asks a question which says, how do you prevent or recognize plagiarism with AI? And that's a really interesting question because it again is a difficult one to answer. And the reason for it being so difficult is that the way we develop and improve artificial intelligences is we tend to do what's called we use what's called an adversarial model. So we'll actually build two AIs. we'll build one AI which develops the responses, and another AI which tries to see if the responses are correct or not. And so with text responses, basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to get an AI which is so good that the other AI can't realize that that's an AI response. And that makes plagiarism checks really difficult. In fact, we're already seeing so that there's what are called text to image generators, which that's what I used for that kind of initial cover photo. And indeed one or two of the other images. In fact, the image that you're looking at of me on screen at the moment, that is the actual image of myself, that is a photograph. The background has been augmented with an AI. In fact, the entire left-hand side of that is completely AI generated. And I just highlighted it and said, redo the background. There was a banner there that I wanted to get rid of. But I was actually this weekend playing around with completely AI generated images of myself as well. But it's difficult. You really struggle to tell what is AI generated and what is not. It's not good enough yet that if you understand what you're looking for, you can't see it. So images, look at the eyes and look at the fine detail. That's a really easy way to see if AI images are generated. In terms of text, you can't anymore. As I said, most of the AIs we have these days would pass the Turing test. They can say, they can mimic humans so well that you can't tell. But there are some works I know in the academic space for checking for plagiarism, in looking at the difference in tone and nuance that AI versus humans. But again, as AI develops, even that will become difficult. And that's definitely a difficult conversation in the AI space at the moment. So thank you very much for the question. Ian Weyer says, aren't a lot of back office systems already simple AI? Take home loans, for instance, area, income, sectional title blocks, histories have updated levy payments. Yes, a lot of back office systems are or can be augmented by AI already. And that was kind of what I wanted to show in this presentation. Sorry, I see Ian says, you are an AI. There's a really interesting question around that and a philosophical one about where we start to distinguish AIs from humans. I'm not going to get into it now. Follow me on LinkedIn. I'm actually going to post about that soon, about how we are just super intelligent AIs. But anyway, back to Ian's other question. Yes, a lot of them are back office, are already things we can augment with simple AIs, such as the chatbot, such as algorithmic underwriting is something I know insurers are using. We've worked on one or two insurers with their kind of algorithmic underwriting models, and it's definitely going to become a bigger and bigger thing in this space as we go. Yolandi's posted one, which I missed. Thank you very much, Yolandi. What ESG risks should we be thinking about when it comes to AI? I think, so this is so the first thing is that a lot of the ESG risks involved in using AI, well, in terms of the environmental side of things, because so ESG, for everyone, environmental, social governance. The environmental side is the same as any computation. Artificial intelligences take computational power. That computational power comes from electricity. So where your electricity comes from, how green is that? Those are going to be your considerations. It's the same as any kind of intense computational workflow in that sense. In terms of the social and the governance side, that's a lot of the ethical and AI and responsible AI discussions that we're having. Is it appropriate for you to be using that artificial intelligence? There's a massive push within the developer community to not use artificial intelligences for defense applications, for military applications. A lot of developers flat out refuse. In fact, there was a massive protest at Google when Google was going to assist with some of the US Defense Force stuff using its artificial intelligences. And the developers and the employees at Google said, no, we're not willing to be a part of this. So there's a lot of questions to ask yourself there. And in terms of governance, as I say, you need to be cognizant of the regulatory landscape of POPI, of GDPR for data collection. And increasingly, there will be regulations on how and what you can do with AI. We already see the UK regulators forcing people to first prove that the AI will reduce discrimination and bias instead of amplifying it before they're allowed to roll it out. And I think that's really, that's what we'll start seeing mimicked in the South African market as well. Nolatando says, how do you build progressive historical data where there is an improvement in wealth with regards to credit applications and AI? I'm not entirely sure of the answer offhand. So this is, firstly, a great question to ask, though. And that's the point. When you're building this, you need to ask those kind of questions. In terms of the actual question itself, so I haven't worked on the credit application AIs. I know they have. I've seen one of my colleagues message me. Apparently, I swore. I apologize. I'm one of those people who that's just part of my language. But yeah, getting back to it. The interesting thing about that question as well. So again, the question, how do you build progressive historical data where there is an improvement in wealth with regards to credit applications? That's a question that's not just AI specific as well. That's a question that even if you're not using AI to do credit applications, that you need to be considering so as to not have these biases in place. And I suspect that's where you'd have to get the answer from. How are we already doing this with humans? How do we translate that to AI? I've seen some in the chat as well, so I'm just going to again, guys, as I said, I'm going through the chat. If you need to jump off, I 100% understand. But I really enjoy having these discussions. So Vanessa says, what are your thoughts or views using AI for underwriting risks? As I say, I already know it's happening. It's definitely happening a lot more in the international market. I know from some of the conversations we've had with South African insurers that they're looking at it. I'm not 100% sure if any have rolled them out yet to actual use case. I think most of them are still, at least the ones I'm aware of, are still in testing stages. I think it's a really powerful tool. I think it's one that will make underwriting better in terms of flagging issues that an underwriter might otherwise miss, and also helping ensure that the checks are done across every underwritten policy as well. I think, though, we need to be careful in how we use it as well. I think in commercial lines, no problems. I think personal lines, we need to be very careful about that historical bias issue. And I suspect because of that, we'll see AI underwriting more in commercial lines than we will in personal lines at the start. I think it will become a bigger thing in personal lines as it rolls out. I also think it might be quite useful in life insurance in assessing and analyzing bigger trends. In fact, I'd be very surprised if the life insurers aren't already doing this with using artificial intelligences to look at your bigger trends data and understand how that impacts your individual policyholders. But yeah, I think it's a really powerful tool. I think it will make underwriting a lot better, and I think it will help our underwriters a lot. And I already know it's, as I say, I know it's already being tested at the very least. Saskia says, is there an obligation on an organization to advise consumers when an AI is in use? E.g., if a consumer is dealing with a chat and they think they are speaking to a person, but they're actually speaking with an AI. There is not an obligation. You don't have to disclose that something is being AI. Is being powered by AI. Should there be? I don't see the harm in requiring people to disclose it. I think more information to the consumer is a good thing, and it allows people to understand what it is that they're interacting with. As you saw from my interactions with the chatbot, those were better because I knew it was an artificial intelligence, and I knew I needed to phrase the questions in a way that an AI would better understand. As AIs develop, that will become less and less of a problem. But I think making consumers aware that this technology is progressively being rolled out is an important thing for people to understand the environment within which they are operating and they are working. So there is not an obligation. My initial thoughts on it in the last 30 seconds of rambling probably should be. And I think that's something regulators need to consider and engage upon. Vanessa, I did see you have another question. I'm just scrolling up to make sure I haven't missed any. So Geraldine has an interesting comment here. Will the AI not be as intelligent as the person feeding the information into the AI? Yes and no. So one, as I said, the AI will amplify the biases of the programmers and of the data that you give it. So yes, in that sense. No, in the sense that AIs aren't programmed to give a response. So we don't say, when you ask this question, you should respond like this. It's free to develop its own responses from the data that you give it. And so in some aspects, it can actually be better than the people who create or program it, because it might have a better understanding of that initial data. For those of you who do look at my LinkedIn posts, the last 3 and continuing forward, those LinkedIn posts are all written with the assistance of an AI. So they're not completely AI generated, but I use the AI to kind of do the general writing. I'll say, give me an article which speaks about X, Y, Z and explains, this, and this, and then I'll go through and I'll refine it and I'll make it better and more sensible and add the narrative and stuff like that. And so in that sense, it's better at writing than I am. It helps get around writer's block, which is something I see AIs being used more and more for. So it's definitely, I think, and also we're starting to use AIs to build AIs. Potential slippery slope, but that will also improve some of the things there. So Vanessa says, so we know that insurers are using AI for commercial crime. Is that wise? Again, is it wise or not? I think that's a broader societal discussion that we need to have. In terms of its actual abilities, I think it's smart though, because commercial crime is, again, one of those spaces where you can use large data to look at trends and then analyze, with the understanding of those bigger trends, the specific data before you to flag issues. And I think that's where AI can really assist in what we're doing. Again, you don't want the AI making the final call. We definitely are not in the space where you can have AIs doing that, but assisting the fraud investigator or the claims manager in potentially flagging things and for further investigations, or highlighting potential problems or trends that people need to be cognizant of. I think that can be really useful. And Ernest on the disclosing conversation says, even better than disclosing interaction with an AI, rather ask if the customer would mind interacting with an AI, opting to refer to a human at any time. That's where you start getting into, so in an idealistic world, 100%, that would be great to give consumers the choice. Of course, the reason using the AI is to try and save costs on having those smaller interactions dealt with without tying up your human capital. And so I think perhaps one of the more interesting ways to do it with that in mind is to flag that it's an AI they're interacting with, and then have an escalation path. So have an option to say, do you think this was, is this response not helpful? They can flag that, and then it will get flagged to a human. I think that's where you can start having those interactions. But guys, 15 minutes over. Thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate speaking on this topic. I too thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope this was informative. I hope you guys at least have a better understanding of artificial intelligences. I think actually, if I do this presentation again, I might add a poll at the end to see if we moved some of those people from not familiar at all, at least up to slightly familiar, if not moderately familiar.